Welcome to Boom Goddess Radio. I am Jennifer Davis Page, your host. Today I have the privilege of having Dr. Michael Engs in our studio. Dr. Michael is the owner-operator of Arizona Heritage Tours. He is a history consultant for organizations like Canola Ranch and Pima County, Tucson Museum of Art, the Tucson Presidio Trust, and more recently, Black Pilots of America. Welcome, Dr. Engs. Our listeners so enjoyed part one of the African Americans in Western Art series that you delivered to us last week. And I so appreciate, and we are delighted that you have agreed to continue to share this amazing story with our listeners once again. To all of our listeners, this is part two of a three-part series. Again, welcome, Dr. Engs.
Thank you again, Jennifer, for inviting me. As you may, as the viewers and listeners might remember, our first installment was really about an adventure that I took with my late partner, Andrea Newman, to discover African-American history of the Southwest through art. Because as I was mentioning then, and I'll mention again, before the Civil War, which we'll talk about later in this particular segment, all the pictures of people that we wanted to find were basically pieces of art. So we began finding that we had a calling from museums to say, why don't you come over and show us some of the art that you're discovering? And the first piece that we discovered was a piece that you see on the screen. It's really based on an account of Dr. Father Font, who was on the Anza expedition of December 17th, 1775. And the lady in the middle, who is Maria Feliciano Arbaio, is one of the many characters that we discovered. One of the exciting things about our research is that we began to see that this is not just history, it's her story, because of the amazing women that we were discovering in our journey through art of the early Spanish colonial period and up and through the Civil War and beyond. In this particular picture, a couple of the lessons that we've learned really come through to us about how African Americans are being displayed in art of this particular period of time. The lady in the middle is described by her birth records in Culiacan. And again, this is the year 1775, though the piece of art was not done until 1873 by an American-born German artist named Charles Christian Nall. And he portrays her as being very light-skinned. We don't know exactly what she might have looked like, but we do know that of the Anza expedition she was traveling with at this particular time in history, 1775, that there were about 20% of them were of African descent. And they were the first people of African descent to reach what is now called California. And this picture would have been taken just as they crossed the river into California. They threw a horrendous party that night to celebrate, and the lady portrayed, Maria Feliciana Arbaio, a mulata libre, is portrayed as you see her. If you go on to the next slide, however, her image begins to remain the same, because in this particular picture, again, you are not seeing a whole lot of people of African descent, even though about 20% of the people in the journey to California were of African descent. You go on to the next slide. This is a performance that we put on at the Presidio in Tucson in December of 2014. And this is the actress that we picked to portray Maria Feliciana Arbaio, because we felt strongly that this may have been the way she looked, but nobody really knows. All we do know is that the various renderings of this particular character, this adventurous and courageous woman, is changing based on the person who reads the story. Because remember, we have a firsthand account from Father Font's diary dated 1775. So everybody who reads that account can imagine what she looks like, but really can't tell what she looks like. Anyway, this is one of the neater things we found in our journey through history, through art of African Americans in the Southwest. And I hope in the long run that other people will start to look at pictures, photographs of African Americans up until the present to help gather their stories as we go into the future. Because one of the things we're seeing is there is the chance of distortion, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And if you go on to the next slide, we move on. This is a picture of a woman who probably preceded Maria Feliciano Arbaio. About 1600, this woman, Olivia De Olvera, marched from Horsitas, which is south of Tubac, now in Mexico, and went all the way to Santa Fe, New Mexico. We don't know why she went. We do know she arrived because she's listed on the records of people who reached Santa Fe that year. And remember, that year, Santa Fe was actually not an incorporated place. It was a frontier town. So for this young woman, probably in her late teens, early 20s, to have marched all the way, again, she was with a party, larger party of about 300 people, shows a lot of courage and fortitude on the part of African-based women. Then this is part of the story we want to reveal. And art helps us get people to see it better and imagine what these women were like at this particular period in time. Her costuming basically reassures us that this is a same period or a similar period. Next slide. Next slide. These are the soldiers of the Presidio. Today, we're going to talk about horse soldiers. And the first horse soldiers to enter southern Arizona were 4 people of African descent who came in 1775, August of that year, to found the Presidio of Tucson and the city of Tucson. This is the uniform they would have worn. They probably were on horseback. They came in late August. I tried to replicate their trip, not by riding a horse necessarily, but by wearing that uniform on Tucson's birthday, August 21st. I'll tell you, it's pretty hot. There was no Gore-Tex, just wool. And you can see how many layers were on there. And in many cases, these soldiers or soldados de cuera, which means vest, were wearing thick 7-layer deer skin vest because they protected them against arrows. And you can imagine how much that increased the heat that they must have been suffering. Anybody who's been to Tucson in August understands that you don't wear uniforms like this, but that's what they were wearing at the time. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see a similar uniform of the soldiers of the Presidio. And these soldiers, as I said, of the 27 who founded Tucson, 4 were of African descent. Same year, Anza expedition that we just talked about with Maria Feliciano Arbaio left from just south of Tucson. 20% of them were of African descent. So some of the first persons to come to what is now present-day United States and Arizona were of African descent. We know a lot about them because of the careful records Father Font and Anza kept on these journeys. So we know what they ate, we know what they took with them, we knew how they dressed, and we're still amazed that the 1619 project of the New York Times that was huge last year for people really ignores the fact that these people came to what is now the United States about 80 years earlier. So we of African American descent have a huge presence here in the United States as far back as 1539 and beyond. And those are the stories that I think we would like to tell and get out there more, especially for young children, because these were not slaves. These were free people. And it's amazing to see the look on people's faces, especially young Black children, when you talk about a group of people going back that far that weren't slaves. This is not a slave narrative. This is a story about people of courage and fortitude who were free, who marched from central Mexico up into the present-day United States, all the way to San Francisco over a period of hundreds of years. And we should definitely be proud of them and teach them in our schools.
Can you tell me how old? Can you tell me how old Tucson is? I think I went to an event last year and they celebrated the 245th birthday. Am I correct?
Yes, yes. Tucson was founded on August 21st, 1775.
Okay.
A year before the Declaration of Independence. And so it goes back a long way. But the first African-based person who we talked about in the first installment actually came into what is present-day Arizona in 1539. So that's even further back. Next slide. And now we're moving on. We want to talk about this gentleman for a while because he helps us really see a lot of not only images of African Americans into the 1800s, but he also helps us understand how they're portrayed in the world of art. This gentleman is Frederick Remington, one of the great, great Western artists, and a person who happened to come to Arizona in 1886. He was coming on the train, and on the train, as we have a wont to do as Westerners, he began to be told stories by his fellow passengers about how dangerous the Arizona-New Mexico territory was, how being captured by the Apaches was a horrific experience where they would bury you up to your neck in ant hills, put sugar in your mouth, and let you sit there in the sun for days. And each day on the train from New York, where he was coming from, on an assignment from Harper's Magazine, the stories got more and more lurid and more scary. And so as a consequence, we think that Remington decided to have a few second thoughts. And he came to Tucson and he met a gentleman named Powhatan Clark, who was commander of the 10th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers. And they became fast friends. In fact, a very recent book called Scouting with the Buffalo Soldiers by John Langolier was written about their friendship. And interestingly enough, the article that Remington wrote about his experience here in Arizona was named after the same title, Scouting with the Buffalo Soldiers. And from that article, we get 10 to 15 sketches which we're about to see of what the Buffalo Soldiers would have looked like. Next slide. Now, the interesting thing about Remington is he was one of the first persons, because remember, photography was not very popular up until the Civil War, when Matthew Brady and others and their battlefield pictures of dead bodies became really popular in the newspapers all over the country because the war was such a compelling experience for all of America. And what Remington did after the war is he decided that he would begin to take photographs and turn them into drawings. So oftentimes you wouldn't have seen this particular photograph of the 10th Cavalry here, probably in Arizona, which is from his personal collection. What you would have seen is a sketch of them that he did, and we'll look at them right now. Next slide. These are the different places that the Buffalo Soldiers would have served. They probably didn't reach Arizona until the early 1880s, and they remained here through 1917 and into World War I, World War II. And all the units, because there were 4 units down from 6 when they were first established, 9th and 10th Cavalry, 24th and 25th Infantry, and all of them served at one time at Fort Huachuca, which is near present-day Sierra Vista in Arizona. And so as you can see, there were many, many experiences that Buffalo Soldiers had over time, as far north as North and South Dakota, as far south as the Mexican border. And we are very fortunate to have some of Remington's sketches to give us a sense of what they may have looked like during their travels and when they finally arrived here in Arizona. Next slide. This is the crest of the 10th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers. As I said, they served for many, many years at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, also Fort Douglas up in Utah. And their story is just an amazing one of how the women built communities for them. One of my favorite pictures of the 10th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers is in 1924 of the church choir of Fort Huachuca. The women are in the center, the men are all around the edges. This is 7 years after the punitive expedition chasing Pancho Villa into Mexico. And you see a community which had churches, sports clubs, social groups, a whole town in and of itself on a military base because they were ostracized by the white population, not only of Sierra Vista, but of Tucson and the other cities. That's probably why they built the fort so far away, is because the Anglo population didn't really want to have a lot to do with them unless they were in jeopardy, and then they called upon them to protect them from renegades, bandits, indigenous people, those types of threats. And when they were finished resolving the threat, they would go back to Fort Huachuca and again into isolation, because the city of Sierra Vista was just a small town at that point, if it existed at all, during most of the time the Buffalo Soldiers were there. Next slide.
Before we go on to the next slide, we're going to take a break and just a short break. And I would like to have our listeners like these videos and to please subscribe to Boom Goddess Radio on our YouTube channel. We'll be right back. Don't go away.
When I first saw Turtle, my heart was full. Now anything but lonely.
We have this like deep connection, this heart connection.
He just wants to be close to you and part of your life.
Every day with Turtle is a perfect day.
When I'm holding her, it makes me feel calmer.
I think everything he does shows how much he loves us.
When we adopt a shelter pet,
We discover
they're a little bit of a lot of things.
But they're all pure love.
love.
Welcome back to Boom Goddess Radio. This is Jennifer Davis Page, and I'm here with Dr. Michael Engs, who is going to continue telling us the amazing story of the Buffalo Soldiers. Go ahead, Dr. Engs, please proceed.
Thank you. Yeah, the picture we're looking at now is another Remington, very unusual because it looks like it's an oil on canvas. And he did mostly sketches, which we'll see in a moment, of Buffalo Soldiers here in Arizona. And you can see the uniform, you can see the horse that they would have been riding. We're right now doing research to see if these are Morgan horses, because Buffalo Soldier groups began to breed and crossbreed Morgan horses for their size and stamina during their time that they were here in Arizona. And we'd like to really kind of verify that before we go deeper into that kind of story and talk about horse people and their love of the horse and the types of horses they would have used. Next slide. Yeah, this portrait is a portrait of an anonymous Buffalo Soldier from the 9th Cavalry, one of the 4 units of Buffalo Soldiers that served at Fort Huachuca. You can tell by the crest and the crossed swords on his head, that's Cavalry rather than infantry. We're extremely excited about projects and how much we learn from this particular, that we learn from this particular adventure that we're advanced on, me as far back as 1983, because every time we go into a new era, a new way of displaying Buffalo Soldier history appears. Right now, we're involved with 2 projects, which may result in a photograph like this being posted somewhere around Tucson or Phoenix or other cities in Arizona. And in those cities, there'll be a QR code at the bottom of this particular portrait. A person can put their cell phone up to it and be linked to a variety of menus that gives even more depth into the history of Buffalo Soldiers. So technology is going to be our friend in the future in terms of advertising these stories that I'm just barely scratching the surface of today as we talk.
Will you have a museum here in Tucson at all eventually to display the history of the Buffalo Soldiers?
That is certainly our hope. Dunbar Pavilion, which is the cultural center, Black Cultural Center in the old African-American school here in Tucson, is actually trying to reach that goal. It's going to take many, many months and years, but if we can use technology to aid us in not only gaining support, but displaying certain works of art like the ones you're seeing now through that technology, then I think we're actually closer than we've ever been before. So I'm very encouraged with our progress and the leadership of Debbie Chase Mabee at the Dunbar Pavilion and others in the community. Buffalo Soldier Monument is going up near Quincy Douglas Library here in Tucson. So we have Buffalo Soldier organizations in support of that concept. So yeah, I'm extremely optimistic about that occurring. Here we have one of the centers of the story, because as I said earlier, John Langolier, author who's written several books on the Buffalo Soldiers, writes about this person, Lieutenant Powhatan Clark. This is the guy that Remington met probably in either Wilcox or Tucson, story varies, on his journey to Arizona in 1886. They became fast friends. And Lieutenant Clark would have become probably a very famous figure in history had he not accidentally drowned probably around 1890s. And he was the one who challenged Remington to go on a ride with the Buffalo Soldiers, or scout with the Buffalo Soldiers as they called it. Next slide. And this is the picture that made Lieutenant Powhatan Clark as famous as he was ever going to become. This became a cover that you'll see in a moment on Harper's Weekly magazine at a time when magazines and newspapers were the only media. And this is the rescue of Corporal Scott. Corporal Scott was one of the Buffalo soldiers under the command of Powhatan Clark. Remington drew this picture from stories that these gentlemen told, and we have it coming down to us as one of Remington's many sketches. The interesting thing about this is a woodblock print where Remington would have sketched the picture. It would have been carved into a block of wood, sent back east on the train, dipped into ink, and then pressed on a piece of paper so you could now see the image that you're seeing here. If you go on to the next slide, we'll actually see the cover of Harper's Weekly, dated, I believe, 1890, so it was long after the event. But here is, again, Lieutenant Powhatan Clark, bandana blowing in the wind heroically, bullets flashing all around them, Corporal Scott on the ground, wounded, and showing the bravery. It suggested that perhaps Remington changed the account because it wasn't Powhatan Clark who saved Corporal Scott, but another Buffalo soldier. But this actually served the audience for Harper's Weekly better.
For our listeners, I'm sorry to cut you off, but for our listeners, can you tell us if Remington's works of art are they in poster form that can be purchased now?
Yes, you can certainly purchase some of these through his website. They're still sold through his estate. Okay. And yes, you can purchase them. They're available.
All right, thank you. I'll get the information so that we can post it so that men and women that want to explore or to purchase, they can.
Sure. So as we go on to the next slide, we understand that Remington was being sent on commission. This is Corporal Scott again in the hospital. Looks like he had to have his leg amputated because of the wound that he succumbed to. And as I said, in his story and his account, he may not have said it was Powhatan Clark. But that, again, that's something that needs more research. And like many pictures and many accounts of African Americans in the Southwest, there's always more than one account. And we're still striving, because many of the accounts are very brief. We're still striving to try to get down to what we call the truth of the matter here in the West. Next slide. This is the beginning of the sketches that Remington would have done when he first came to Arizona in 1886, probably at the San Carlos Apache Reservation. It's called Sign Language, and it shows a Native American talking to a Buffalo soldier. And the reason that we as African Americans have to be cautious about Remington's depiction of the Buffalo soldiers is because he fell into the trap of depicting them as caricatures. You can see both the Native American person, probably Apache, and the Buffalo soldiers are what we call caricatures. Now, this doesn't have to happen. We know that other artists like Winslow Homer, right after the Civil War, just before this period of time, depicted African Americans as very beautiful, very dignified. There's a picture called Cotton Picker that Winslow Homer did of two women, obviously before the Civil War, in slavery, standing in a cotton field, and they are beautiful. So we have to be cautious as we look at the art of the past and how we are depicted, and begin to question how we want to be depicted as we move into the future. Because remember, one of the largest populations of people for caricature collectibles of African Americans are in fact African American people. And whether we want that image to continue on into the future is still, I think, a debate within our community that we still need to have. Next slide. This is an excellent, excellent drawing of Buffalo soldiers, probably the 10th Cavalry. It shows them all their equipment, the Sheridan saddle, the Sharps carbine, They would have had 45 caliber pistols. They have a canteen, saddlebags. He has a saddle at his feet, which also contain a Indian rubber slicker, which they would have put on in bad weather. Of course, it didn't breathe like current products do. So as a consequence, he probably sweated as much as he was getting wet from the rain. And he has those high boots indicating Calvary, because they would have had those, and the spurs that he has on his boots. The interesting thing, you can see he's probably smoking a corncob pipe, and he stored the tobacco because it came in long strips that are about a foot long and about 3 inches in circumference. And you grab a piece of it, sprinkle it in your pipe and smoke it, stick it back in your boot. I'm wondering how that could have tasted after several days in your boot, especially because oftentimes they didn't change clothes every day, but that's another story. Next slide. This depicts the Buffalo Soldiers and their major mission at the time, 1886 through 1888, when Remington was here. Another Remington sketch, block print. And what you're seeing is the look on the faces of the settlers, many of them escaping from the horrors of the Civil War in the South, coming to Arizona and California and Texas. And they weren't real happy that Black people who had once been enslaved by people just like them were all of a sudden now their protectors. So you can see Remington capturing that look on the faces of the settlers, and the pride in the Buffalo Soldiers is saying, we got over here, didn't we? And that's one of the amazing stories that we continue to tell, because the treatment of Buffalo Soldiers in the West was not the best. They always received the least of anything, and yet still served with dignity. And we have a phrase for that now. We call it indemnity. It's a legal term. It means if you're serving and protecting another group, you deserve respect and reward. Whether or not the Buffalo Soldiers and subsequent groups who served the military as African Americans ever truly received indemnity is a question I still think needs to be answered. Coming from a military family, having served in the military, it's something that I hear in a lot of discussions among African American veterans, even to this day. Next slide. Another block print. This is Captain Dodge to the rescue. This is a story about a troop of mostly all Anglo soldiers, because remember at this time, the Army was segregated. This would be probably 1870s into the 1880s. It's another block print, and it tells us an awful lot about Remington's focus in his artwork and how he depicted the Buffalo Soldiers, because what we're seeing here is the horses bursting out of the print in motion, the Buffalo Soldiers splitting off onto two sides to suggest movement, because Remington's goal was to depict the horse. In this particular picture, the Anglo soldiers had been surrounded by Ute Indians somewhere in northern Colorado. They had escaped onto a shallow river with a sandbank in the middle. They had shot most of their horses, and they had been surrounded by the Ute Indians. That night, one horseman.
Dr. Michael, we're going to continue with that night on part 3 of our series. We've run out of time for this particular portion of your story, and I'd like to thank you for this amazing story on part 2. I want our Boom Goddess listeners to, I want to thank you for sharing your time with us. And I'd like you to like our videos and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Boom Goddess Radio. And I would also like you to stay tuned for part 3 of Dr. Engs' story on the Buffalo Soldiers. And thank you for joining Boom Goddess Radio.